People are always asking actors if the makeup hurts their faces and if they ever forget their lines. Well, the answer to these two classic questions is fairly simple. The makeup doesn't hurt our faces, and we do forget our lines. In the theater, of course, we have prompters, and in television, often we have what are called teleprompters, at least in America. That's a machine that's installed right over the lens. It's particularly useful for politicians making earnest political speeches. They have their lines, which are written beforehand, printed on little bands which run right across the camera. And that very intense, intelligent, and patriotic expression is sometimes simply a nearsighted politico trying to follow the words. And he says, now what we must all strive for, and you get an interesting effect then. Two, there's something called the idiot board. The idiot board is basically a film device. The idiot board is, but it's used in TV. Also, it's consisting, as it does, of big blackboards with the words on it. It was invented by the Barrymores, I think by John Barrymore, and used a good bit by Lionel, too, and subsequently by a good many actors, a good many of us, I should say. The words that we're supposed to say are written on these blackboards, which are held by fellows who stand behind the camera and move along behind the camera, showing what the words are. And that gives, too, an interesting look to the actor's face, a sort of faraway expression as he spells out the words. I have a friend whose name is Charles Lederer, a wonderful fellow, a screenwriter with a good deal of humor and imagination, who was, during the war, a director of documentary films. And he was making one in the Far East, a dull little documentary involving a general, a very important and high-ranking general who had to make a speech in one of those little shorts that were shown to the men. I think it was a film about keeping our barracks tidy or something of that kind. And the general couldn't remember his words. And he was very much reassured when when Captain Lederer told him that it was all right, that Captain Lederer would hold up an idiot board, rather like this. So the general wasn't embarrassed at all to be using an idiot board. He felt every inch of Barrymore and very much a member of the profession as he looked earnestly into the middle distance to read the words which Captain Lederer was holding up for him, just as the lights turned on and the camera started to roll. And what the general saw were the following words: why not make Lederer a major? Well, luckily, the story has a happy ending. Charlie got to be a major instead of being disciplined in some horrid way. The general had a sense of humor. As I say, there are all sorts of ways of taking a prompt, but in this particular show, I don't need a prompt because, of course, I make it up as I go along, at least find the words as I go along. And I have in front of me the sketches from my various sketchbooks which suggest our subjects. And tonight I have a few drawings of people who aren't here anymore and whom I miss. Now, this is Harry Houdini, the master magician. The whole world must miss Houdini, certainly the whole theater world, because he was, without any question, the greatest showman of our time. Nobody, as a matter of fact, who ever played the halls, either in England or America or anywhere, received his salary, and nobody deserved it because he could get out of anything. As you may remember, he was called an escapologist, an escape king. He was an expert in miracles. I'm proud to say he was my teacher in magic when I was young. As a favor to my father, he did give me my first lessons in the art of conjuring. But I'd like to tell you my favorite story about Houdini. Had to do with his visit to the Kremlin, the night he rang the bells in the Kremlin. This was in a private performance for the royal family, for the Tsar and the royal family, with Rasputin in the background gnashing his teeth with jealous rage. And Houdini had asked for the various people in the small audience to write on slips of paper some impossible thing they would like to have performed. And one of them had written, "Ring the bells in the Kremlin," or so. Houdini had arranged it that this would be chosen apparently by free choice. And to ring the bells in the Kremlin may not sound like much, but as a matter of fact, at that time, there were no ropes connecting the bells, and for a century at least, they'd been silent. So after this command, Houdini moved to the window, raised his arm. It was a snowy night. There was a moment's very dramatic pause. And then, over the snow-covered square, there could be heard first very dimly and then finally, in full chorus, the bells of the Kremlin. You could imagine the effect of that, particularly on Rasputin. Now, ordinarily, I don't explain how tricks are done. No magician, amateur or professional likes to do that. But in this particular case, I think I can tell you that since it's unlikely that anyone will be doing this particular trick again, as Houdini raised his hand, his wife, who was standing at a window in a hotel at the other side of the square, which was right near the bell tower, his wife received the signal and with an air gun shot the bells. Bing, boom, 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 like that. It's always struck me as a particularly ingenious miracle. And of course, those kind of tricks are the best, really. There are all kinds of tricks. As I say, he taught me magic, taught me the beginnings of magic. I had other teachers, including the great Chinese long-tack Sam, but Houdini was the disciplinarian. I'd sit in his dressing room backstage at the Hippodrome or wherever it happened to be, and he'd make me go over and over in a trick. He told me once, I remember, you must practice a trick, Orson, 1,000 times before you perform it. But I was absorbing this, I remember, when there was a knock on the door, and a fellow from Carl Bramer, who was a manufacturer and artisan of magic tricks, came in and said, hello, Harry, I've just got a new vanishing lamp. Here it is. New principle. Harry said, fine, I'll put it in the show tonight. That was the beginning of, well, of great disillusionment on my part. Because, of course, you don't practice tricks 1,000 times. You practice sleights, methods of doing tricks. But I must apologize because I'm sure that I'm not interesting the ladies, because the very subject of magic is not deeply interesting to the female sex, as all magicians know, to their cost. I remember once performing a miracle rather in the style of Houdini's, a humble little miracle, but it cost me $75 to do, in honor of a young lady whom I was courting. And this was the miracle. I asked her, it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon in Central Park, if she would take a card, any card. All ladies know how boring that is, but I didn't know that it was boring, and I asked her to take any card. She took the card I wanted to, and I asked her, would she like the card in her purse or in my pocket, or would she like it written in the sky, written in the sky? She said written in the sky, and I pointed a la Houdini to the heavens, and she looked up, and there, sure enough, written in the heavens over New York was the 7 of Hearts. I'd hired a sign writer, a sky writer, one of those aeroplanes with the smoke, and given him $75 to write the name of the card in the sky. But as I say, she said, well, you must have seen it up there before you did the trick. Anyway, it's just a trick. You see, magic is not really for the ladies. They don't like to be fooled. You watch an audience when a conjurer is working. The men will all say, oh, that's interesting. How does he do that? And the girls will all say, well, it's very clever, of course, but it's a trick. There must be some way of doing it. And you do another trick, and usually we bring out those silk scarves and those awful-looking feather flowers and all those things that we use in magic. The purpose of all that is to brighten things up and to keep the ladies' eyes focused on the stage. And the jokes that we try to tell and the other things we do are to cheer them up, because, as I say, they become increasingly irritable. There's always the rather hard expression coming into the eyes, and invariably before the evening is over, the remark, well, of course there's a way of doing it. I didn't know that when I spent the $75 on the skywriter. Well, here's John Barrymore. who was certainly as famous as Houdini. Houdini could get out of anything, and Jack Barrymore could get into anything. He was also one of the greatest actors I ever saw in my life. But we remember him and miss him very much because he was such a personality and such a very original one. I remember one day in the Brown Derby restaurant in Hollywood, I was sitting with Jack and 2 or 3 other assorted friends. And Jack Barrymore was a great storyteller, but a rather Rabelaisian one, and he was telling a story in his fruitiest and most Elizabethan style. And there was a tourist, obviously a fellow from the Middle West, sitting at the next table with his wife, very respectable-looking gentleman with a celluloid collar. And I became aware that our neighbor was quite shocked with Mr. Barrymore's storytelling, and pretty soon the gentleman came over to the table, made a little speech about how embarrassing it was for himself and for his wife to hear this sort of talk going on, and Barrymore paid no attention whatever, and then I saw the man go away and come back with the head waiter and again a little speech. We've come all the way to Hollywood, and there's certainly a very bad impression we're receiving of you actor people, and I tried to indicate to Jack Barrymore that he should censor himself, but made no impression at all. And then I saw a little bit later through the window that the tourist gentleman and the head waiter and a busboy and, of all things, a traffic policeman from the front were on their way into the restaurant. And I finally got through to Jack with the news that the board of censors had really descended on him. Jack finished his story just as this procession came to a halt in front of our table. Jack turned around, looked at them with a full Barrymore glare, said, "What is this? A peasant with a petition?" Well, John Barrymore may have invented the idiot board, but he didn't need it always, certainly not in the theater. He could do Shakespeare without leaving out a single line of the poets, and even sometimes adding a word or two of his own. As for example, here in London, when he was doing Hamlet, you know the tea business in the matinee performances. I needn't dwell on it, but it is a rather startling experience for a visiting American actor, particularly the sight of those trays as they go floating through the darkness after the second interval. You see them as the curtain goes up, and it does rather resemble a spiritualist seance. They seem to be suspended in midair, but of course the clattering is an earthly sound, and a very definite one. And Jack had just come to the tag just at the end of Hamlet and made his last speech, "The rest is silence." He suddenly moved down to the footlights, stared at the poor Wednesday matinee audience, and shouted, "Tea! Tea! Tea!" at which the curtain fell. And I'd like to think of him shouting tea or something insulting like that at us over the footlights. I'd certainly like to speak of him always as Sweet Prince, to wish him good night and to hope that flights of angels sing him to his rest.